Hi, this is Blaine Pardo. I'm a best-selling author and host of the show, The Front Lines, where we talk to authors who cover a different variety of subject matter. And today, it's going to be a lot of fun because it's a book that has a lot of resonance and meaning to me. And I'm going to open with a couple of quotes here and talk a little bit about the subject, and then bring our guest, Daniel Miller, in. First one I wanted to say is a quote from C.M. Houston: Texas will again lift its head and stand among nations. It ought to do so, for no country upon the globe can compare with its natural advantages. And this concept of Texas being an independent nation is something that really resonates right now, especially with all the political turmoil going on. Um, Paul Vandervelder in 2012 wrote an op-ed for the LA Times that said, "This marriage has run its course. Too many niggling little things built up over time, driving us all crazy. Let's just stop. It's time to divvy up the china and draft a property settlement." If that sounds crazy, I want you to consider a few things. Texas isn't alone in this quest for independence. There's movements in New Hampshire for this. There is efforts sometime in Hawaii and even California. The UP of Michigan has threatened to separate from the rest of Michigan. Washington, D.C. is screaming for statehood. So there's a lot of these efforts to let people control their own destinies. And that's what this is really all about. And to talk with us about that today, I've got a good friend of mine and fellow author from Defiance Press, Daniel Miller. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Hey, Blaine, thanks for the invitation.
Oh, sure. Before we jump into your book and what the subject is, because it is really pertinent now more than ever, tell us a little bit about your background. I know you recently ran for office. A lot of people in Texas probably already know who you are, but this goes out to a nationwide audience. So I want to give you a chance to set your credentials up.
Yeah, so officially, I'm president of an organization called the Texas Nationalist Movement. I'm by trade, I'm a technology consultant, married with 6 kids. But on August 24th, 1996, that was the day that I made the decision to work for Texas independence. And I've been studying, researching, and working for it ever since. The TNM was founded in 2005. Since then, our organization's grown to be the single largest political advocacy organization in the state outside of the 2 major political parties. So we've taken the issue of Texas independence, or Texit as people call it, from polling in single digits in 2005 to now 66% of likely voters are in support. So we've been busy. We joke a lot and say that we're a 24/7, 365 organization, but that's ultimately what it takes to put the power of self-government back in the hands of the people.
Well, your book, Texit, is really outstanding. I read it and reviewed it last year, I think it was, or year before. It's really a stunning book because I thought it was going to be more, when I got into it, the impassioned pleas why this should be done. And you do cover that. But what I was stunned at was the amount of detail that you guys had put into this book that really dealt with the economic factors and the long-term political implications of all that. I was wondering if you could explore a little bit of that for people who haven't read the book. Why is this actually considered feasible? Because I was stunned when I read it. You really did your homework.
Well, I appreciate that, and look, I had a lot of years to prep for it. The thing about when any nation, any group of people, any country wants to pursue self government, they want independence. It deserves a tremendous amount of thought, right? It never goes well if it's a knee jerk reaction. Now, you will hear people talk about, from an academic standpoint, the remedial right of secession, and so you have these things happen throughout history where, look, the tyranny is just so egregious that it becomes a matter of self-preservation to just declare independence, a unilateral declaration of independence. But what we see is, particularly in the latter half of the 20th century and then moving into the 21st, you see these as real political processes, right? And so for us, it was really about making sure that we did the homework. We studied this not just in the microcosm of where we are, but it really in its true global perspective. At the end of World War II, there were roughly 54 recognized fully sovereign countries around the world. By the end of the 20th century, there were 192. Those countries didn't fall from space. The earth didn't get any bigger. They were people like us who just happened to think that the best people to govern themselves were them, right? So we approached it from that perspective. And when I wrote the book, I wanted to encapsulate as much as I possibly could without getting just so into the weeds, right? There are a lot of factors about this, but frankly, when you boil it down, here's what it comes down to. Number one is that it ultimately must be a political decision by the people. Okay. And I get that from Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution, which echoes that late 18th century kind of growing of the idea of the people being in control of their governments governing by consent of the governed. So Article 1, Section 2 of the Texas Constitution reserves to the people as an inalienable right the right to alter, reform, or abolish their government in such manner as they may think expedient. So, as an inalienable right, this decision must ultimately rest with the people. The people have to vote in a Brexit style referendum. Is generally the way that people can comprehend it. But once that happens, it's surprisingly simple. The factors where things settle in, right? Post vote, you have constitutional issues, statutory issues, international covenants, treaties, and agreements, and then finally negotiated issues with whatever political and economic union you're withdrawing from. And that really is true pretty much across every independence movement that we studied in the lead up to the formation of the TNM.
Well, let me ask you, because you make an incredibly compelling case for it in your book, and it scared me a little bit because I don't live in Texas. And the thing that goes through my mind is, yes, I think based on what I read in your book, I think Texas could function as its own nation, and it has before. And I think a lot of Americans forget that, that Texas is one of the few sovereign entities that was its own country before it came into the United States. So it's done it before. The question is, and I'll pose it to you, can the United States function with Texas not being part of the Union? I'm kind of curious because there wasn't a lot in your book that really hit on that, but because it really took it from the Texas perspective. I'm kind of curious, what's the flip side of the coin look like?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a legitimate question, but I'll tell you, from our standpoint, we advocate for Texas, but what we have encouraged everyone to do is take a look at the same issues that we're talking about in their respective states, and I think ultimately your question is really about not whether or not the United States can survive without Texas, but whether or not the United States as an institution, a political and economic institution, is really suiting the people in the states that are a part of that institution, right? And I think once you begin to divorce yourself from sort of the nostalgia and the romanticism that we have, sort of been, I guess, indoctrinated into related to the United States, and begin to look at it as a political and an economic union, like it is an institution, then you can begin to make some real, I think, logical and rational assessments about whether or not the people of your state are being served. And Blaine, this is how we put it, just very simply. When I released Texas back in 2018, the vast majority of media came from outside of Texas that wanted to talk about the book. And the way that I put it to them is the way that we're talking to the voters of Texas. And it's simply this: ask yourself this question. If your state was currently a self-governing independent nation, like the 200 some odd self-governing independent nations around the world right now, right? You had control over your own border policy, your own immigration policy, your own monetary policy and currency, your own military, your own tax policy. You had your own embassies and passports. You had all of the things that 200 other self-governing independent nations around the world have. And instead of talking about withdrawing from the union, the conversation was about whether or not you would join the union. knowing everything you know about the federal system today, would you vote to join the union?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you, this especially coming up on this election cycle with the issues
Yeah.
that Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, et cetera, have been facing with immigration, where decisions at the federal level are dramatically impacting the states and their ability to manage, govern, et cetera, plus the huge financial impacts of those decisions. It feels very contrary to me, as an American and as someone who respects Texas. I'm wondering how you couldn't want to separate from the union, because Washington D.C. is inflicting pain on your state, and it's financial pain, it's law enforcement pain, it's a lot of pain being inflicted, and there doesn't seem to be any recognition of that. Is that part of what drives this thinking?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think to a certain degree, right? So, one of the things, and this is very Texas specific, but I think it could apply across a whole host of issues, right? But for about the last 15 years, the issue of greatest concern for Texas voters has been the border and immigration, right? So they will typically poll those two separately, but we know they're inextricably linked, and so you tie them together. That is the greatest issue for Texas voters, and so what you have is you have Texas voters that are looking at their number one concern, and they're looking at a federal government and a federal policy that has had a trajectory to do everything they can to stick a finger in that wound and twist it every chance that they can get. And so, as Texans, we look at this disconnect not as being Texas withdrawing from the union. We're looking at the institution, the federal institution, has long withdrawn from the document that holds us together, right? That would have allowed us, if followed to the letter, allowed us to alleviate some of the pressure that we're dealing with on a whole host of issues. And so as such, we're not withdrawing from the union. We're withdrawing the union from us. And we're doing so in a positive way by reasserting our status as an independent nation, very much like the founders, pre-Constitution 1787, felt about their newly formed states post-revolution. So, the fact of the matter is that we're at a point now. We have to realize that institutions like the United States, the federal government, do not last forever. Any student of history can tell you that maps change, institutions change, governance changes. What we're saying here in Texas is we no longer want to see our government forcibly changed in front of our eyes. We want to preserve a constitutional republic and the principle that rights are inherent and inalienable. And we believe that the government that governs best governs least. We're not saying that we need to enforce that on everyone else. If they want to go a different direction, that is entirely up to them. But ultimately, everyone is going to have to make a choice on this issue.
The problem I have is your argument's compelling. That's
Awkward.
the hardest part to this. And that's the part I enjoyed about the book was I went in a little bit jaded because, I'm a student of history, and as much as I enjoy reading about the Civil War, I'm like, I don't want to see something like that trigger.
Yeah, no one does.
And I don't think you do either. But as I went through it, it was like, wow, the case is laid out kind of bare here. And I started to realize that I look at our government locally and I'm like, we're constantly dealing with the federal government meddling in things that 100 years ago or even 50 years ago would have been dealt with at the state level. And when we see even issues like abortion get moved back to the state level, there's this uproar in Washington, D.C. about, well, no, we want to set certain rules and we want to change what's in the Bill of Rights and modify that and not do it legally, but just simply make the changes. So it really is amazing. Your book really captures this and does it in a very narrative format. Yeah, one of the things I'd like you to kind of talk about is the economics of this.
Sure.
Because that was a compelling piece of your argument was it's one thing to say, look, we want to govern ourselves, but it's another to say, and we actually can do it. Like we can afford it. We will have the money to do it. You really did a really good job of detailing it. Can you walk people through at a high level, at least, what some of the economic factors are around this?
Sure. Look, I'll kick out just a few facts from a Texas perspective, but Blaine, before I do that, I just want to address the issue that you just brought up, which is, there is this sense that a self-governing independent nation has to be a certain size or have a certain type of economy to be viable. But to be fair, as part of the union, um, I don't know that any of our individual states have really been able to exercise their full economic capabilities. Okay. So, what I encourage people to do is pull out a globe, spin it around, put your finger on any landmass that's not Antarctica, and realize those people they have a government. They have the right of self government, right? And all of these things, whether it's economy, politics, military, they figured these things out and done so in what is appropriate to them. And granted, some have, more resources than others. There are some factors that play at that. But from that standpoint, and this was taught to me many, many years ago by Dr. Thomas Naylor, it's not about self sustainability, it's about viability, right? When you begin to look at whether or not a group, a state, a country can be a self governing independent nation and how well they will fare. Okay. So, that being said, as it stands right now, Texas is currently the ninth largest economy in the world. And so, it's a pretty impressive statistic. I think it should be much higher, and here's why. Number one, part of the big economic argument here in Texas is the fact that we overpay anywhere from 103 to 160 billion dollars annually into the federal system, right? So that's money that comes out of our pockets, goes to the bureaucracy, the 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats in Washington D.C., to then be spent in other states or on other things that don't benefit really anyone, right? So that is we always we like to talk in terms of hurricanes down here where I live in Texas, and so in the book I equate that. I put the price tag for Hurricane Harvey. This is that 103 to 160 billion dollars leaving our economy every year is the equivalent of Hurricane Harvey hitting Texas every 9 months. I mean, it's insanity, right? So you've got that one aspect from an economic perspective that if the federal government is no longer in the picture, that revenue stays here to be spent according to our priorities or to go back into the pockets of taxpayers, which can be spent in other ways, right? To jump the economy up. And that one move alone could probably jump Texas from the ninth largest economy in the world to the seventh or eighth. But there's one other stat that I talk about in the book, and it really applies to all states. And it's that study that came out of George Mason University about federal regulatory accumulation. There were actually two studies on this, and I think I mentioned both in the book, but there were two studies, and they corroborated one another. But essentially, here's what it boils down to. Since 1949, we have seen the growth of the federal superstate in the sense that it is one level of regulation upon another level of regulation upon another level of regulation. I equate it to the house that gets painted every single solitary year without scraping off the previous coat. The federal government has never met a regulation they don't like. So they don't repeal or replace, they just lay more regulation on. So what that study found was that in that growth from 1949 to the time the study was released, which was about 2015, I think it was, it had caused federal regulatory accumulation caused a 2% compression of GDP annually. Well, that effect compounds, right? So it's a compounding effect. So at the time the study was released, the bombshell from it was simply this: if there could be a bombshell in an economic study, right? But the bombshell was this. And it was that were it not for federal regulatory accumulation, then everyone's take home pay essentially would be 600% higher. Because of federal regulatory accumulation, it was robbing everyone of about 85% of the value in take home pay. So what they said is that at the time the study was released, median household income was about 52,000, I believe it was, and they said in the absence of federal regulatory accumulation over those years, it would have been 330,000. So I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure I know a lot of people that would appreciate a 6x increase in their paycheck.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's amazing to me. You know, like I said, you did such a great job in Texas walking people through the case as to why and how. And that's really the focus of your book is those two things. It doesn't say when, um, but it really focuses on how it could be done. And I was impressed with the fact that it wasn't this violent separation. It was, we're going to do this legally and we're going to do it above board. But it's entirely possible. And I think the thing I walked away when it was done was I was like, wow, if Texas does this, I'm really happy for Texas and I'm really sad for the United States. Like we lose in this to a certain degree because I think Texas brings a lot to the culture of our country. So I mean, there's a lot that's kind of tied to that. Tell me
Well,
about.
but hang on, Blaine. I know you want to jump on, but I really want to. I really want to talk about that because
No, no, let's.
the one thing that people need to understand is that any state leaving the union doesn't disappear from the earth, right? It does.
Sure.
It's not Texas withdraws from the union. It's not suddenly Australia surrounded by ocean all around, right? It's not an island. What we have seen over the last 75 years in these instances is when these places like what we're trying to do here in Texas withdraw from these larger bodies, the relationship on the other side of it is not typically adversarial, right? So you think about what those ties are. You're going to wind up, you're going to have a trade agreement, you're going to have a travel agreement, you're going to be signing on to some of the same international conventions. You're going to another one that I think is people miss out on all the time is Texas and any other state that withdraws from the union will still have common defense concerns, right? So there is some indication that there will be a mutual defense agreement on the other side of this. Not saying that Texas would sign on to NATO because that may not necessarily be in our security interests, but those national security interests, those defense interests, there is general alignment and agreement on those sorts of things. So you come out in a situation where much like 22 other self-governing independent nations have a free trade agreement with the United States that is effectively the same as they were states, right? The no barriers to entry, no tariff, those free trade agreements. So they get their self-government, they get the same sort of economic advantages of free trade with the states, with the exception that they don't have to take a knee to 2.5 million unelected bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. They get to set their own direction and their own policies and operate in the best interest of their people. And I'll say this, and I know you want to get on, but I liken this to Margaret Thatcher's Bruges speech, right? So that speech that she gave back in the 80s, which was right around the time the common market was spinning up, Thatcher gave this speech to essentially explain her resistance to the common market, or specifically the common currency. I think she ultimately knew it was going to end in sort of that drive over the European Union right now for a United States of Europe, and I think she had the foresight to be able to see that was coming. But in that speech, what she talked about was that she was hitting back at critics, I believe, who were claiming that she was anti-European and very much the same kind of slurs we get about being anti-American. And what she said was, look, American or European is not the same as being a part of the common market. We will always be European by virtue of our history, by virtue of our geography, but we also enjoy the right of self-government, right? But that doesn't make us any less European. And I think the conflation between the United States of America versus America, and the fact that a lot of people unfortunately don't realize that those are two separate things. I think that creates it. But once you get to that place in your mind and you understand the difference between the institution and sort of the shared history, the culture, the geography, then it begins to make a lot of sense for a lot of people.
Well, and that's where I was going to go next. Is honestly, the title of your book being "Text It," it reminded me of Brexit. And I
Right.
remember when Brexit came out, and I'm sure you do as well, there were all these stories of doom and gloom that were going to happen. It was, we're
Yes.
not going to be able to get tulips shipped into the Britain, and the border with Ireland was going to collapse. And, this was going to cause economic and socio-political chaos and turmoil. And we haven't seen any of that. Um, that turmoil has been really kind of minimal for the people of the UK. They separated from the European Union, and the fallout was that they're not tied to the Nord gas pipelines and dependent on Russia for their fuel this winter. I mean, what lessons have you learned for your movement based on what you've seen from Brexit?
Oh, look, all of the independence movements around the world have been very instructive. But Brexit, I think, was one that was very relatable for everyone. We there are some elements I think that we can see here in Texas with the Scottish independence movement, less so from a policy perspective, obviously because the SNP definitely not seeing any policy alignment with what we want to do here in Texas, but sort of their trajectory. But Brexit, I think, was the major touchstone for a lot of people that showed them that look, this can be done. There were a ton of lessons that we learned from the importance of having a pressure group like UKIP. Although they were a political party, they effectively operated as a, as a pressure group on the political question. They always stood out there and could potentially operate as a spoiler, which drove a lot of the public policy surrounding Brexit up to the announcement of the vote. That showing that they had in that general election prior to the David Cameron calling for the vote, I think was a big shot across the bow. And conservatives believe that if they didn't give the people the vote, they were going to pay a price next general election. So that was obviously one lesson: the importance of a pressure group. The second was really the importance of having an effective, well-funded political movement, which we saw with UKIP and then ultimately Leave.eu. Aaron Banks really helped those guys professionalize. It's one of the things that Farage talked about. Farage left the party for a while as party leader because the executive committee over there did not want to professionalize, and that was one of the stipulations when he came back was we're going to get pro and we're going to get pro fast. The other thing too is, and I think this is a cautionary tale, and I tell it often for our people here in Texas, is that your path to independence has to take into account changing out the establishment politicians that have fought against it. You know, the any pain that has been caused to the UK by the Brexit issue has been can all be traced back to politicians in power that were Remainers from the start. They didn't want Brexit. They did not want to respect the will of the people. Right? They could even David Cameron, as much grief as I gave that guy when he was prime minister, he at least had the courage of his convictions once the vote came in to resign, to say, look, I fought against this, but the people have spoken and they're going to want this carried out, and I'm not the person to do that. That you got to give the guy kudos, but there were too many closet Remainers. So very important lesson from Brexit was that. Finally, I think really the final lesson was that Project Fear is alive and well. They will say or do anything possible to scare the people into maintaining their subservience to that system and not having their voice heard. So, I would say if I were going to do some real kind of bullet pointed takeaways from Brexit, it would be those.
I think you hit the nail on the head. The one I would add too is it was amazing to me how well, even though the people had spoken and the vote had been taken and the decision was made, how there was a massive concerted effort to overthrow that decision.
Oh yeah. The
And
Ramoners were
that was
terrible.
frightening in many respects, because I was like, this could go to blows, you know. And the people who voted just move on. They're like, no, let's revote on it. They didn't know what they were voting for.
Sure. Well,
And
look,
I
that's the
remember
European
that.
Union's MO, Blaine. I mean, look, you obviously have studied history, and so in recent history, that's the European Union's MO, which is they don't like the result. Whether it was any of the treaties that they tried to pass. I mean, I think they pushed Ireland to the polls 3 separate times until they could get their admission into the European Union across the finish line, simply because the European Union, they when they don't get what they want, they spin up all of those non-governmental organizations, those push groups to push for a do-over. They do it. They've done it time and time and time again, and it's one of the reasons that the European Union, as an institution, has lost tremendous credibility across Europe, and Eurosceptic organizations are growing, much like the Amerosceptic organizations that are growing here.
Well, you know, it was interesting because the first exposure I got to this was when we were at the censorship conference a year ago. And your book was there, and there were people there from your movement who were gathering signatures. And I actually got a chance to talk with a charming lady about it, because I didn't know anything about it at that point. And it's amazing to she was showing her she had already gathered and talked about the flexibility of the movement and how they're really focused on certain key aspects of this. I was like, wow, this is not some crazy group of people off to the side, you know, which that I'm
Facebook
sure the
group.
media has tried to paint you that way,
Sure.
you know. And I looked at it, I was like, this is a serious thing. And it's, the people you had out were articulate, they were clear, they were concise, they expressed very much like you. They worked through a bullet list and really drill the points home. So what kind of support do you currently have? You mentioned 66% of people are kind of in favor of this already. Where are you at with this movement? What kind of time frame are we looking at? Or is it more of let's build it, and when the time is right, we're going to kind of pull that trigger? Is there a date out there that you're looking at?
Yeah, there is a date. So let me kind of answer the support level question first, and then I'll take you down kind of the path of what to expect next. So, I told you when we started in 2005, this issue was polling in single digits. We had really, I think, our first polling breakthrough in 2014, right around the time of the Scottish independence referendum. There was a Reuters Ipsos poll out there that showed that it was a majority of Republican voters would vote out. We were right at kind of half and half on independent voters and 35% of Democrats. That should have been a bombshell, right? The media should have been all over that. They didn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. But here's the good news, Blaine. I don't care what the media says, because we just continue to do the work. We go out and reach the voters. We're talking to people. They can talk to empty houses on their legacy media all they want to, but we're out there talking to the people, and we're making the case. And so 2014 was the breakthrough for us. Then you saw in 2016 a floor fight at the Republican Party of Texas State Convention, which is the largest political convention in the world. I think it's 9,000 delegates and alternates plus others. It's like 11,000 people. And so there was a big floor fight over it, which the chairman, according to many people, stole from us to add a plank on the platform calling for a vote on this issue. It was a plank that was subsequently added in 2020, so it became the official position of the Republican Party of Texas in 2020 to at least support the right of Texas to withdraw. Then this year, which the Republican convention was this year, the state Republican convention added not one but two planks to the party platform calling for a Texas vote, one that was not date specific and one that called for it in 2023. Right on the heels of that result, which, by the way, it didn't pass by 50% plus one. It was almost 90% of the delegates, just shy under, like just tenths of a point away from 90% of the delegates voted in favor. So now you've got the dominant political party in the state of Texas that holds every statewide elected office, that holds majorities in both houses, and a sizable number of county chairmanship or county judgeships, right? So it's the dominant political party. It's now the official position that they want a vote on Texas. Then, right on the heels of that, there was a Survey USA poll that was released that should have been another bombshell, right? Which it showed. I had been saying for a long time, one of the reasons the establishment fights against giving us the vote is they know if it goes on the ballot, it wins, and it doesn't win by a little, it wins by a lot. Well, the Survey USA poll was confirmation of that, where you had 66% of likely voters come out and say that they would vote for Texas independence. That breakdown was astounding. It was 76% of Republican voters, it was 54% of Democrats, and 53% of independent voters. So, we're on a trajectory right now. We have the support to the point we're telling our volunteers, look, we're not looking to convince anyone right now. This is not the time for debate. We're looking for the convinced, right? We're organizing to legislatively make this happen. So we get through the general election, pre-filing for legislation. The next session starts 2 weeks after. The legislative session, and many people don't know this about our legislature, but we have a true part-time legislature here. They meet for 140 days every other year. So we are really bound to the calendar. So they will meet in January with the new legislative session. And then we're on a dead run to get the Texas Independence Referendum Act filed and passed during that time. Now, the good news is, and we've worked a lot of legislation before, but the good news is that we actually got the referendum bill filed last session. Now, granted, we have to start all over again, but they said we would never get it filed. We got it filed. They said that no one beyond the author would ever sign on to it. Well, that wasn't true. We had other legislators sign on, including the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House. So we're already in this process of gearing up for January. January's coming, and Texas is riding in, and we're going to be riding. We're coming in hot, Blaine.
I love it. I'm actually really kind of fired up, and I'm a little bit jealous. Virginia isn't driving for this at all, but I got to tell you, it's so patriotic what you're doing, because it's like, look, I just want to govern myself. I don't want all of this overburden weighing me down. And I mean, it's really inspiring what you're doing. It's incredible. Now, let me ask, this is an important question. How can people be a part of this? What are your websites? How do people connect with you? How do they get your book too? Because I want to make sure I know it's on Amazon, but
you mean this book?
Yeah, it's a good book. I read it and I posted a review on my blog on it. I really enjoyed it. That's why I invited you on today. But let's talk about how people can engage with you, because I think there's going to be a lot of people out there that say, well, wait, I want to be a part of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, it's pretty straightforward for us. We believe in driving people to a single spot. So what I would encourage people to do is, if they have questions about Texit and frankly, any issue, like if you're in another state and you just want to know some of the nuts and bolts of Texit, obviously you can buy the book, but if you'd like a concise place to go, you can go to texitnow.org. We have got the 100 most asked questions answered in excruciating detail, from what are you going to do about a military, what happens to federal pension benefits, to even the mundane, what happens to my favorite sports team. And I'm not kidding, we have been asked. So we answered, right? We're proving that these things all have answers. So texitnow.org has all those questions answered. Additionally, if somebody is already on board, they're saying, look, I'm ready to get in the fight. I want to make Texas independence a reality, or at a minimum, at least give the people of Texas a vote on the issue, right? That's the first step. They can head over to our website at tnm.me. That's tnm.me. And there you can find all kinds of ways to get involved, whether it's just registering your support, becoming a member, making a contribution, or becoming a volunteer. That is the jump off point for anyone who wants to plug into what we're doing, including getting access to our own internal social media app. We've got, we're probably the envy of some other political advocacy organizations, but Blaine, it's because we want to win. We want to win.
I gotta tell you, yeah, you make such a great, compelling case for it. It's hard for anybody to not support it. And I do recommend you guys pick up his book, Texit. It's fantastic. Where can they get the book? Amazon, I know.
Yeah, it's available on Amazon. It's also available on the TNM website, and I think there's a scattering of other online retailers. I mean, you got to remember, this book has been out since 2018. It was an Amazon. It got on Amazon's bestseller list for like I think 4 separate times, 3 or 4 separate times. And the odd thing is that it's not dependent upon some sort of external situation. It's just suddenly something happens and people are looking for it, and boom, text it lands in their lap. So there's a lot of different places, but it's available on the TNM's website as well. And I would encourage people to go there, purchase copies there, support the movement by doing so. Because honestly, between seeing Texas become self-governing and independent again, or seeing Jeff Bezos launched into space one more time, which would you prefer?
I'd rather have Texas be independent. I look forward to the day when I show up and get my passport stamped by the Republic of Texas. I think that would be something really special, and I want to do that the day you guys declare your independence, because I want it. I want that capability.
Well, come on. Yeah, you will always be welcome here, Blaine.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Daniel. I appreciate you coming on today. This is an exciting topic. And like I said, anybody who kind of goes, oh, this is all something that's not happening. This is happening in 5 or 6 states right now where this type of movement, be it separation between splitting a state in half or separating from the former union, is something that's really happening out there. And I think people need to pay very close attention to it. And taking a look at this movement really gives you a blueprint about how to do it and how to do it right. Thanks again, Daniel.
Hey, thank you, Blaine. Appreciate it.
Talk to you soon.